What the hell could have possibly happened to these hikers? I've hiked thousands of miles over the years, and I'm not gonna lie, I've had a few brushes with death in the process. I've dodged falling boulders, I've encountered bears, wild animals, and I've battled through raging storms, and yet despite all of those dangers, well, obviously, I always made it out of the woods alive. But not every hiker is so lucky. In this video, I'm gonna be telling you 3 chilling, true stories of hikers who walked into the wilderness and were never seen again afterwards. No bodies, no final messages, just eerie clues and, quite frankly, a lot of unanswered questions. Oh, and trust me, you're gonna wanna stick around until the very end of each story, because that's when I'm going to be revealing the most unsettling theories about what might have really happened to these hikers. And so with that said, let's take a virtual trip together right now to one of my favorite places in the entire world. That would be the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Now, this trip is totally free, but you gotta hit that subscribe button. Nay, smash that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer of the channel. All right, let's go. So welcome to the White Mountains. It's here on September 9th, 2007, that our very first mystery begins. So on that very day, 46-year-old Kevin Race scribbled down a few words on a piece of paper. He then left that note in his home in the town of Woolwich, Maine, just over the border from New Hampshire. And then he drove his car back over that border into New Hampshire and drove for several hours until he finally reached the base of the infamous Mount Washington. Now, those of you from New England, or even just the Northeast in general, you probably know what Mount Washington is. Maybe you even have one of those famous bumper stickers. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't know, Mount Washington is the highest mountain in the Northeast, and it has a reputation for being one of the most dangerous mountains, not just in the Northeast, but in the entire country. It's really, really crazy. And on this particular day, September 9th, 2007, Kevin Race was about to become the mountain's very next victim. Or was he? Was he really? Is that actually what happened? Let's explore. So Kevin drove all the way to the Pinkham Notch Visitor Center, which is probably the most popular trailhead for Mount Washington. It's a trailhead I've been to countless times before. He drives there and then he began hiking up the mountain. When he was a few miles into his hike, Kevin briefly stopped and chatted with the caretaker at Hermit Lake Shelter. And little did that caretaker know, that would end up being the last time that Kevin Race was ever seen dead or alive. Ooh, last time he was ever seen? Is that what I just said? Yes, it is. And obviously, that means we're about to get into some very disturbing details. And so before we get there, I just want to take a moment to kind of lighten things up, take a chill pill, if you will. And I want to tell you about Drink Element. So Drink Element is the sponsor of this video. Now, like I said a second ago, I've been to Mount Washington a bunch of times before, and it's pretty steep, and I sweat a lot when I'm hiking mountains like that. And if it wasn't for Drink Element, I don't even know if I would freaking be here right now. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but when you sweat like that, when you're hiking or you're doing any exercise, anything at all that makes you sweat, you got to replace your electrolytes, and you've really got to do it with Element, and here's why. If you walk into Walmart or whatever your grocery store is and you look at the electrolytes they have in stock there, well, I can almost guarantee that they're all gonna have a bunch of sugar and other crap in them that you don't really want to put in your body. And Element is different. They don't have any sugar, they don't have any BS. All they have is the electrolytes that you need, and they have a great taste, and that's the other thing. So you really want to try all their flavors, and you can do that by going to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That is drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking, or just click that link at the top of the description. When you make a purchase through my link, you're going to get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. What are you waiting for? You got to do it right now. One more time, drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. And now let's get back to some of the more disturbing details about this story. So Kevin Race goes missing on Mount Washington. And the truth is that at first, at the very beginning, we'll say, his disappearance kind of seemed like a typical missing hiker case. And I obviously don't take any pleasure in saying that. I mean, there's really nothing normal about a hiker going missing, but it does happen. And at first, it really did seem like it was a pretty normal case. However, it didn't last like that. It very quickly turned into something much more sinister and, frankly, something much more suspicious. And the reason I say that is because of the note that Kevin had left for his friends and family back at his home. Remember that note I told you about at the very beginning of this story? Well, that note indicated that Kevin was obviously going to Mount Washington and that his disappearance was actually no accident after all. You see, the note said that Kevin went to Mount Washington, quote, looking for his final resting place. Now, this obviously implies that Kevin went to the mountain in order to take his own life. And of course, that begs the question, why? Why would he do this? What was his motive? This was the question on everyone's mind, including the minds of the authorities. And as it would turn out, there was a glaringly obvious reason why Kevin might want to take his own life, or perhaps why he might want to fake his own death and then kind of just start over new somewhere else. You see, 10 years prior to his disappearance, Kevin had started a company in Maine called Custom Cordage, and he started this company with his business partner, whose name was David. I'm going to leave the rest of his identity out of this. And so everything was normal with the business at first. You know, it was your classic small business, your classic partnership. But at some point, a few years in, Kevin allegedly got greedy. According to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, Kevin began to embezzle company funds by writing checks and using credit cards. And as usually happens in embezzlement cases, this theft was not just a one-off event. It went on for years. In total, investigators allege that Kevin stole around $250,000 over a 5-year period. Kevin was facing up to 10 years in prison, and coincidentally, he was scheduled to go to court on September 11th, 2007. And as you'll recall, that is just 2 days after his disappearance. And of course, because he disappeared, he never showed up to court. And because of this, they put out a warrant for his arrest. And while they were drafting up that warrant, literally at the exact same time, searchers from New Hampshire Fish and Game were scouring the slopes of Mount Washington, doing anything they could to try and locate the missing hiker. But once again, this was not a normal missing hiker case. Again, as much as it pains me to say that, it wasn't even a typical search effort. And I say that because investigators weren't even sure if they were looking for a missing hiker or if they were looking for a man who was intentionally evading law enforcement, a man on the run. Now, one of the detectives that was looking for Kevin said, quote, "He's not just a lost hiker. He could be a hiker on the run because of his legal problems in Maine." Despite a massive search and manhunt for Kevin Race, no sign of him has ever been found to this day. And of course, this has left a lot of people speculating whether or not he really did end his life on Mount Washington, or if he used the hike that day as a diversion and successfully ran away and started a new life somewhere else forever. Now, Kevin's car was found parked at Pinkham Notch, and once again, he was confirmed to have been seen by that caretaker while he was hiking up the mountain, and therefore we know for sure that he was on Mount Washington that day. And in addition to that, 2 days before his disappearance, Kevin apparently had a conversation with his brother where Kevin stated that he had recently visited some family property and also visited a relative, doing both these things for the first time in years. That was a bit out of the ordinary, and Kevin's brother took those actions, as well as the note that Kevin left at his house, as signs that Kevin was actually preparing to end his own life. Now, personally, I do think that's the most likely scenario, and obviously a very tragic outcome, but still, the fact that Kevin went missing in an area that is very popular with hikers. Again, I've been there a bunch. Like, it's probably the most popular trailhead in all of New Hampshire. And the fact that no sign of him has ever been found, and of course, combined with the fact that he had a very real motive to fake his own death, well, all those things, they just kind of make you wonder. Let me know in the comments what you think happened in this very bizarre disappearance. Oh, and speaking of bizarre, this next missing hiker story is just as bizarre, and honestly, it's even a little bit scary. So I get asked all the time if covering all of these stories on my channel makes me like more scared to go hiking. And while I totally understand the question, the truth is that covering these stories doesn't make me more scared to go hiking, because in almost every story that I cover, there is an obvious reason why the bad thing that happened. Does that make sense? I mean, someone usually made an obvious mistake or a bad choice in gear, or they were hiking in terrain that they weren't familiar with, that they frankly didn't have any business hiking in the first place. But however, despite all that, every now and again, I will come across a story of an experienced hiker who, by all reports, did everything right and yet still found themselves in a desperate situation. This is one of those stories. And so that's why it's so scary for me, to be honest. And so on August 14th, 2016, 50-year-old Gordon Sagu and two of his friends were hiking a mountain called Baby Monday Peak in British Columbia, Canada, when something went horribly wrong. Now, Gordon was a very experienced hiker and a trail runner. He had picked up the hobby a little bit later in his life. He was in his mid-40s at the time, but by August of 2016, this dude knew exactly what he was doing. He had ran marathons before, and in addition to that, he had hiked in this particular area in British Columbia multiple times before in his life. He was familiar with this kind of terrain. And so at some point during the hike, Gordon decided to separate from his hiking partners so that he could go and explore another peak. And so the plan essentially was for the other two hikers to continue going on down the trail towards this lake, and then everyone kind of agreed to meet up at a determined rendezvous point later in the day. Gordon was equipped with all of his day hiking gear and even was carrying up to 3 liters of water at the time. And so these two other hikers didn't really think much of it. They watched him kind of just walk off into the distance. And then a few minutes later, they even spotted Gordon a little bit ahead of them on the trail, kind of a black dot up ahead, just kind of climbing along, going ahead as if, nothing was wrong. But the hikers did eventually lose sight of Gordon. And when this happened, of course, they didn't realize it at the time, but it turns out that would be the last time that Gordon was ever seen. The hikers continued on to their rendezvous point. They waited and waited, but Gordon never showed up. And so eventually they came to the chilling realization that something must have happened to him. And so they were left with no choice but to continue on back to the trailhead where their cars were. And of course, they hoped that maybe Gordon would actually be there waiting for them instead of meeting at their rendezvous point. It makes sense, maybe Gordon took a wrong turn, and maybe he decided it would be best just to return to his car, something like that. But of course, to their horror, Gordon wasn't at the trailhead either. Can you imagine the sinking feeling that these hikers must have felt when they realized this? They must have known that something just awful had happened. And so they began driving back towards the nearby town of Chilliwack, and they called search and rescue as soon as they got cell reception. And though the situation was obviously very desperate, I imagine that search and rescue probably felt some initial optimism when they first received that call that Gordon was overdue. And I say that because once again, Gordon was familiar with the type of terrain that he was lost in. He was fit, he was experienced, and though he wasn't carrying any overnight backpacking gear, I have no doubt that he was probably carrying the bare essentials at the very least, things like a rain jacket, good shoes. We know he had a lot of water with him. And so if he had an injury and was just lost on the trail somewhere, and that's why he couldn't, make it to their meeting point, the chances were pretty high that he could at least keep himself alive long enough for rescue to go find him. However, one point I need to make is that at least in my understanding, and I'm not 100% on this, but I'm pretty sure that one of the things that Gordon was not carrying was one of these right here, which is a satellite GPS with an SOS feature. This right here is the Garmin InReach Mini. It's a really popular one for hikers because it's like the lightest one and stuff, but there's other ones out there. And of course, if Gordon had one of these and he hit this SOS button on the side here, perhaps he could have been rescued. Now, I will say, back in 2016, these devices were not nearly as common as they are today. I mean, I never carried one back then and for years afterwards. And so I'm not judging Gordon for this at all, but there is a pretty good chance that his rescue would have been a lot simpler if he had carried one of these. But then again, I can't say that for sure because we just don't know what happened to Gordon. I mean, there have been circumstances where hikers went missing even though they were carrying these. And so there was a massive search trying to find Gordon. I'm talking a massive search. I say that a lot, but multiple different search and rescue organizations, government resources, helicopters, drones, dogs, everything. And yet, no sign of Gordon was ever found. And to this day, no sign of him has ever been found. And that, of course, raises a few very important questions. I mean, how is it possible that a man as experienced, knowledgeable about the area he was in, and physically capable as Gordon could disappear into the wilderness without a trace? I mean, I could see him suffering an accident and then possibly dying as a result of that. That does happen on rare occasions, but I would still think that his body would have been found at some point. I mean, it's been almost 10 years, and I already know what a lot of my very well-meaning viewers are going to be commenting right now, which is, the fact that he was hiking alone. He's separated from his group intentionally. People are going to say that solo hiking like that is the reason why this happened. And don't get me wrong. Like, I get it. Solo hiking does raise the risk. There's no question about that. However, I just got to say, as someone who's hiked thousands of miles, like I told you at the beginning of this video, if I was hiking in an area that I was familiar with, I was carrying the proper gear for a day hike like this, and I was feeling good physically, I wouldn't think twice about separating from my friends to go explore a different area. And I know that might sound crazy to some of you, but I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm telling you how it is. Experienced hikers go solo all the time, and disappearances like this very, very rarely happen. Once again, when hikers go missing or they get into trouble, more often than not, it's because they didn't really know what they were doing. But that clearly wasn't the case with Gordon. And it almost makes you wonder if something extraordinary happened here, like an animal attack or foul play with another human. I don't know. And to be clear, there's no evidence of those things happening. I mean, it really is just a mystery in the truest sense. And I guess just to play devil's advocate a little bit, while I've never hiked in British Columbia before, I have hiked in the Cascades of Washington State, which are just a little bit south of where Gordon went missing, just over the border into the United States. And I gotta say, the terrain up there is pretty gnarly. And so I can see how even an experienced and fit hiker could potentially take a fall and then maybe end up in an area where nobody will find them. Not to mention, it's possible that Gordon actually went off trail, either purposely or unintentionally, and this could have resulted in him having an accident or a medical event in an area maybe that nobody was able to search. I really don't know. And so let me know what you think might have happened to Gordon in the comments. And most importantly, just keep him and his family in your hearts. My heart goes out to them. And once again, I just want to stress that if you're ever going to do any solo hiking, you got to get one of these life-saving devices. Maybe it wouldn't have saved Gordon. I don't know, but there's a good chance it might have. And so I've linked a number of these, of different price points in the description for you to check out. No sign of Gordon was ever found, but that was not the case for our next extremely disturbing hiker disappearance. In this story, almost everything that the missing hiker had with them was found except for the missing hiker themselves. At 11 a.m. on July 8th, 2014, 69-year-old Sylvia Apps walked into the woods of British Columbia's Strathcona Provincial Park. She was supposed to emerge from the woods just a few days later on July 13th, but Sylvia was never seen ever again. This story is quite similar to the last story in that Sylvia, just like Gordon, was a very experienced hiker. I mean, let's be honest, you kind of have to be if you're still going on multi-night backpacking trips by yourself when you're pushing 70 years old. Sylvia was known to be carrying 2 cell phones, navigational equipment, and of course, all of the standard overnight hiking gear that every experienced hiker carries. When she hadn't returned from her hike by around 4 p.m. on July 13th, she was reported missing, and very, very quickly, a massive search was launched. Once again, I don't use the word massive lightly. I mean, I'm talking almost 200 ground searchers being deployed, many of them using search dogs. They were using helicopters and planes. I mean, they were throwing everything they could at this situation in order to try and find the missing hiker. But after searching and searching and searching for nearly 2 weeks, Sylvia was still nowhere to be found, and eventually they had no choice but to call off the official search. Now, once again, as much as it pains me to say this, everything that I've told you so far is pretty standard when it comes to a missing hiker case. And what I mean is that, it usually goes something like this. The hiker's reported missing, a search is launched, they can't find the hiker, and then the search is eventually called off. However, the search for Sylvia Apps had a few strange discoveries that make it a very unique and, in my opinion, very baffling search compared to many other stories that you're going to hear about missing hikers. So, a short time into the search for Sylvia, her blue backpack containing almost all of her gear was found. It was found there just kind of sitting in the woods, almost like it was abandoned. And yet, Sylvia was still nowhere to be found. She wasn't with the backpacking gear. And I want you to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the searchers at this point. And I want you to tell me how you would feel after discovering this backpack. I mean, on one hand, finding the backpack probably would be a good indication that Sylvia herself was nearby somewhere. I mean, how far could she have strayed away from her gear, right? It doesn't really make sense. So that would make me feel kind of optimistic about finding her. But on the other hand, why would her gear be abandoned like that in the first place? The more I think about it, discovering her gear might actually make me feel a little bit worse. I mean, how high could her chances of survival be in the harsh British Columbia wilderness without any of her gear? I mean, obviously that's a very bad situation. And so let me know how you would feel about the discovery of the backpack if you were on the ground searching. And then I need to tell you something even stranger about the situation that happened after the discovery. So there were 3 things missing from the scene of Sylvia's discarded backpacking gear. Number 1 was Sylvia herself, of course. And number 2 and 3 were her camera and her hiking poles, respectively. And what's strange is that these 2 items would go on to be found, but they were found in a completely different area than her backpack and the rest of her gear was found. So why could that be? I mean, that's very strange. Like, wouldn't all the stuff be together? I don't know. It just doesn't really make sense. And the only other clue that I'm aware of in this case is that on July 10th, so that's 2 days after she started her backpacking trip, Sylvia signed the logbook on the summit of Castle Crag Mountain, making that very summit her last known location. Now, once again, I haven't hiked in BC before, and so I really can't give a personal description of this terrain. This was on Vancouver Island, but I think that this particular quote from Paul Berry of Comox Valley Search and Rescue sums things up pretty well. It's highly technical. Right now, we have a rope team descending into the area from above, and we have a mountain rescue team climbing the snowfield below to take a look at the small crevasse, to take a look between the rock face and the snow face. Now, it's not really my business, but I do wish there was more public information on this case. Like, for instance, photos of Sylvia's gear, or even the specific location of where her gear was found. I mean, the best that I could find was this low resolution photo, which roughly points out where it was found. But I mean, this obviously isn't that useful. And quite frankly, it only leads me to speculate even more. And so with that said, let's just go full speculation. What could have happened to Sylvia Apps? That's the question. And my hunch, which could be totally wrong, to be totally transparent here, my hunch is that she might have dropped her gear off kind of at the base of Castle Crag Mountain so that she could tackle the nearly 6,000 foot peak without having to carry all that extra weight, right? Like she wanted to drop her pack, go tag the peak, come back down and pick up the rest of her gear and then move on, right? This is something that I've done countless times, particularly in the Adirondack Mountains. A lot of people do it there. And it just makes sense that she would have kind of left everything except for her hiking poles and her camera, you know, so she could take a picture at the summit. Like it makes sense that she would have left all that stuff behind and only taken the poles and the camera. We do know that she 100% reached the summit. And so maybe something happened to her while she was descending back down the mountain. And that kind of explains why her camera and her hiking poles were found in a different location from the rest of her gear. I don't really know, guys. That's just a gut feeling. It's probably completely wrong. The only thing I do know for sure, and Sylvia's searchers would agree with this wholeheartedly, will say, is that it's very, very strange that pretty much all of her possessions were found, everything, and yet over a decade later, no sign of Sylvia herself has been found. How could that be? And to be honest, that's a question I really don't have an answer for. It's very unsettling, especially as someone who has done a pretty good amount of solo backpacking. I don't know. It's a scary one for sure. And my heart goes out to Sylvia and her family and her friends, of course. And also, I mean, I just got to say it again. This story is another reminder to always carry a satellite messenger with an SOS button on it. Let me know what you think happened to Sylvia Apps. Let me know if you think any of my assumptions were off here. And one more time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, especially if you made it this far into the video. I appreciate all of you very much. My give back call out today is going to be the aforementioned Comox Valley Search and Rescue. Folks, this is an all volunteer organization that risks their lives to save hikers and other folks who run into trouble in the backcountry. And what you have to understand is that the bravery and the generosity of groups like Comox Valley, it's so incredible. I mean, can you imagine heading into the mountains at like 3 a.m. in the middle of the winter to try and save a stranger, someone you've never even met, and not being paid a single penny in return for your trouble? I mean, this is the kind of thing that these folks do. They're heroes, and these groups always need funding, and so I've made a small donation to them, and I encourage you to click their link that I have in the description and do the same. Even if it's just a few bucks, you know, it doesn't have to be anything crazy. I would really appreciate that. And YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, so give it a click. And folks, you are genuinely the best audience on YouTube. I'm so freaking grateful. And so leave a comment if you made it this far into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.